1992, Ontario Finance Minister Jim Flaherty argued that the Canadian government could boost healthcare funding for, quote, real people in real towns, end quote, by cutting the bureaucracy that serves only Native peoples. The extent to which Native peoples are not seen as real people in the larger colonial discourse indicates the success of sexual violence among other racist and colonialist forces in destroying the perceived humanity of Native peoples. As Aimé Césaire put it, colonization equals thingification. As Stoller explains his process of racialized colonization, quote, the more degenerates and abnormals, in this case Native people, are eliminated, the lives of those who speak will be stronger, more vigorous, and improved. The enemies are not political adversaries, but those identified as external and internal threats to the population. Racism is the condition that makes it acceptable to put certain people to death in a society of normalization, end quote. The project of colonial sexual violence establishes the ideology that Native bodies are inherently violable, and by extension that Native lands are also inherently violable. As a consequence of this colonization and abuse of their bodies, Indian people learn to internalize self-hatred because body image is integrally related to self-esteem. When one's body is not respected, one begins to hate oneself. And a Native boarding school student reflects on this process. Quote, you'd better not touch yourself. If I looked at somebody, lust, sex, and I got scared of those sexual feelings, and I did not know how to handle them. What really confused me was if intercourse was a sin, why are people born? It took me a really long time to get over the fact that I've sinned, I've had a child, end quote. As her words indicate, when the bodies of Indian people are designated as inherently sinful and dirty, it becomes a sin just to be Indian. Native peoples internalize the genocidal project through self-destruction. As a rape crisis counselor, it was not a surprise to me that Indians who have survived sexual abuse would often say that they no longer wish to be Indian. Native peoples' individual experiences of sexual violation echo 500 years of sexual colonization in which Native peoples' bodies have been deemed inherently impure. The Menominee poet Christos writes in such a voice in her poem, Old Indian Granny, quote, you told me about all the Indian women you counsel who say they don't want to be Indian anymore because a white man or an Indian one raped them or killed their brother, or somebody tried to run them over in the street or insulted them, or all of it, our daily bread of hate. Sometimes I don't want to be an Indian either, but I've never said so out loud before. Far more than being hungry, having no place to live or dance, no decent job, no home to offer a granny. It's knowing with each invisible breath that if you don't make something pretty they can hang on their walls or wear around their necks, you might as well be dead, end quote. Mending the Sacred Hoop to Technical Assistant Project in Duluth, Minnesota, reports that a primary barrier anti-violence advocates face in addressing violence in Indian country is that community members will argue that sexual violence is traditional. This phenomenon indicates the extent to which our communities have internalized self-hatred. Frantz Fanon argues, in the colonial context, as we have already pointed out, the natives fight among themselves. They tend to use each other as a screen, and each hides from his neighbor, the national enemy. Then, as Michael Tussig notes, Native peoples are portrayed by the dominant culture as inherently violent, self-destructive, and dysfunctional. For example, townsperson Mike Whalen made the following statement at a 1990 zoning hearing calling for the denial of a permit for an Indian battered women's shelter in Lake Andes, South Dakota. Quote, Indian culture, as I view it, is presently so mongrelized as to be a mix of dependency on the federal government and a primitive society wholly on the outside of the mainstream of Western civilization and thought. The Native American culture as we know it now, not as it formerly existed, is a culture of hopelessness, godlessness, of joblessness, and lawlessness. Alcoholism, social disease, child abuse, and poverty are the hallmarks of this so-called culture that you seek to promote, and I would suggest to you that the brave men of the Go stands would hang their heads in shame at what you now pass off as that culture. I think that the Indian way of life, as you call it, to me means cigarette burns and arms of children, double-checking the locks on my cars, keeping a loaded shotgun by my door, and car bodies and beer cans on the front lawn. This is not a matter of race. It is a matter of keeping our community and neighborhood away from that evil that you and your ideas promote, end quote. Similarly, in a recent case among the Aboriginal peoples of Australia, a judge ruled that a 50-year-old Aboriginal man's rape of a 15-year-old girl was not a serious crime, but an example of traditional culture. He ruled that the girl, quote, knew what was expected of her and didn't need protection, end quote, when raped by a man who had been previously convicted of murdering his former wife. An expert anthropologist in that case testified that the rape was, testified that the rape was, quote, traditional and morally correct, end quote. According to Judy Atkinson, an Aboriginal professor, survivors have reported numerous incidents of law enforcement officials dismissing reports of violence because they consider such violence to be cultural behavior. We are living in a war zone in Aboriginal communities, states Atkinson's. Different behaviors come out of that, she says, yet the court of law validates that behavior, end quote. Taussig comments on the irony of this logic, quote, men are conquered not by invasion but by themselves. It is a strange sentiment, is it not, when faced with so much brutal evidence of invasion, end quote. But as Fanon notes, this destructive behavior is not, quote, the consequence of the organization of his nervous system or of characterial originality, but the direct product of the colonial system, end quote. Tadiar's description of colonial relationships as an enactment of the, quote, prevailing mode of heterosexual relations, end quote, is useful because it underscores the extent to which U.S. colonizers view the subjugation of women of the native nations as critical to the success of the economic, cultural, and political colonization. Stoller notes that the imperial discourses on sexuality, quote, cast white women as the bearers of more racist imperial order. By extension, Native women are bearers of a counter-imperial order and pose a supreme threat to the dominant culture. Symbolic and literal control of their bodies is important in the war against Native people, as these testimonies illustrate. Quote, when I was in the boat, I captured a beautiful Carib woman. I conceived desire to take pleasure. I took a rope and thrashed her well, for which she raised such unheard screams that you would not have believed your ears. Finally, that we came to an agreement in such a manner that I can tell you she seemed to be been brought up in a school of harlots, end quote. Quote, two of the best looking of the squaws were lying in such a position, and from the appearance of the genital organs and of their wounds, there can be no doubt that they were first ravished and then shot dead. Nearly all of the dead were mutilated, end quote. Quote, one woman, big with child, rushed into the church, clasping the altar and crying mercy for herself and unborn babe. She was followed and fell pierced with 12 lances. The child was torn alive from the yet palpitating body of its mother, first plunged into the holy water to be baptized, and immediately its brains were dashed out against a wall, end quote. Quote, the Christians attacked them with buffets and beatings. Then they behaved with such temerity and shamelessness that the most powerful ruler of the island had to see his own wife raped by a Christian officer, end quote. I heard one man say that he had cut a woman's private parts out and had them for exhibition on a stick. I heard another man say that he had cut off the fingers of an Indian to get the rings off his hands. I also heard of numerous instances in which men had cut out the private parts of females and stretched them over their saddle bows and some of them over their hats, end quote. The history of sexual violence and genocide among Native women illustrates how gender violence functions as a tool for racism and colonialism among women of color in general. For example, African American women were also viewed as inherently rapeable. Yet where colonizers used sexual violence to eliminate Native populations, slave owners used rape to reproduce an exploitable labor force. The children of black slave women inherited their slave status. And because black women were seen as the property of their slave owners, their rape at the hands of these men did not count. As one Southern politician declared in the early 20th century, there is no such thing as a virtuous colored girl over the age of 14. The testimonies from slave narratives and other sources reveal the systematic abuse of slave women by white slave owners. Quote, for a period of 4 months, including the latter stages of pregnancy, delivery, and recent recovery therefrom, he beat her with clubs, iron chains, and other deadly weapons time after time, burnt her, inflicted stripes over and over again with scourges, which literally excoriated her whole body, forced her to work in inclement seasons without being duly clad, provided for her insufficient food, exacted labor beyond her strength, and wantonly beat her because she could not comply with his requisitions. These enormities, besides others too disgusting, particularly designated, the prisoner, without his heart once relenting, practiced, even up to the last hours of the victim's existence. End quote. But it was a report of a North Carolina slave owner's abuse and eventual murder of a slave woman. Quote, my master was a good man, but he was pretty bad among the women. Married or not married made no difference to him. Whoever he wanted among the slaves, he went and got her or had her meet him somewhere out in the bushes. I have known him to go into the shack and make the woman's husband sit outside while he went into his wife. He wasn't no worse than none of the rest. They all used their woman like they wanted to, and there wasn't nobody to say anything about it. Neither the woman nor the men could help themselves. They submitted to it, but kept praying to God. A slave's testimony from South Carolina. End quote. Some of the troops, quote, a white complained to their commander, Rufus Saxton, have forcibly entered the Negro houses, and after driving out the men, in one instance at the point of a bayonet, have attempted to ravish women. When the men protested and sought to protect their wives and sisters, they were, quote, cruelly beaten and threatened with instant death. The morals of the old plantation, Saxton feared, seemed revived in the Army of Occupation, from a report of the activities of Union soldiers during the Civil War. Again, I'm going to stop here, but upload this to the internet 1 sec.